Out of all my books, what was the hardest one for me to write? There were two, actually. One, it's still in manuscript. I'm going back and I'm revising it and re-editing it before I send it off to the publisher. And that was because I had broken a bit of a format. It's the latest one in the Roadhouse Sun series. And with the other four, they had all been together. They were a group. There was a dynamic, there was an energy, they fed off of one another, they encouraged one another, they inspired one another, they provoked one another. It was like being with your friends, you're hanging out with them. And in this one, I decided to do something different, and I took the main character out of the group and I put him in a situation kind of by himself. Quickly realized that he could not function in this environment. I kind of brought in one or two other characters from previous books to try and carry that along. That also didn't work. So I realized, that took me well over 2 or 3 years to write. The other book that was the hardest was my history book, In the Shadow of Old Burke Mountain. On the one hand, it was hard to write because it took me 35 years to do that. But I was spending that time researching and collecting stories and letters and manuscript, data, and records, and all sorts of things. But then the real challenge came in how was I going to actually write it and put it together? Because one of the things that I absolutely hate about local histories are how they are only written for a select group of people. Basically, if you don't live in that community, you're not going to care. And that's the premise they operate from. They will talk about, people that were the first settlers, where in 1807, so-and-so built a shingle mill in the house where so-and-so lives now. Unless you're from there, you don't know the house where so-and-so lives now. And in one generation, so-and-so isn't going to be living there, somebody else is. So you have just basically dated your history. And one of the things that I liked was the fact that history, key word in it, is story. I wanted to tell a story, but how am I going to do that? And when I got the idea from being in a store in Williston, Vermont. And the storekeeper there was very involved with local history, and he was very involved with colonial reenactments and Vermont history especially. And he was the one that put a mug in front of me and said, this was how storytellers were paid in the old days. You wanted to hear a story, you wanted to hear an account, you wanted to hear history, you bought somebody a drink, and then they'd tell you what they knew. If you wanted to hear more, you bought them another drink. Put it together in a way that somebody will want to buy you a drink to hear. And that was how I was able to put my history book together. I put it in a series of stories, each one from the time period that I was working with. I started in the 1700s and I went through to the 1900s. I told their stories. It wasn't just dry dates and facts. That did have to get put in there so you could have records and reference and go back and find the stuff to look out yourself. But basically, I told the stories behind all the facts and all the figures. And that was another thing, that a little bit of advice that I had been given, not so much when I was as a writer, but when I was an historian, because history is my passion. And I was researching, and somebody told me, it's one of my old wrestling friends, Al Friend, fitting name. He had been a manager and everything in Midlands, in the, Kansas City and so on. He had been on the Dumont network and everything, and he was just a really, really great friend. And he told me the story of the dash, which is basically the most important thing you're ever going to see. When you look at somebody's headstone or marker or whatever, you will see two dates: the date they were born and the date they die. But the most important thing you're ever going to see on the headstone is that dash in between. Because in that dash are contained all of their hopes, their dreams, their successes, their disappointments, their ideals, their friendships, their relationships, their adventures, their tragedies, their triumphs, everything. Everything is in that dash. Try to make all my books that dash for my characters. And sometimes that's hard. What do I put in? What do I leave out? How do I say it? So when those two people gave me that little bit of advice, how to approach history, how to approach writing history and telling history, that made it a lot easier. But yes, those two books were the hardest ones I ever had to write.